Hey, Pacific Southwest District. It's your mission exec, Dominic Rivkin. And just thinking about a few things when I think about Jesus' ministry. He had that big, broad ministry to crowds and crowds of people who would come and they'd listen to him, and he'd impart the wisdom, like the Sermon on the Mount, and those types of things that we still value today. But then also he would obviously gather smaller groups, like his 12, right? And he'd teach those 12 very specific things and in very specific ways. And then even go smaller than that, like even down to 3, the Peter, James, and John type of thing. And, thinking about that, the way that Jesus taught, the way that he interacted, is something that we need to think about, especially now where we're seeing different ways of doing ministry, from the big gathered, the crowds, to how we're now scattered. We're all in our homes, and what that looks like in smaller groups. So thinking about that, and along with our president talking about that it takes all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people, we could think of nobody better to talk to about that than Karl Vaters. And Karl is a pastor at Cornerstone Christian Fellowship in Fountain Valley, California. And he's going to be actually with us to do a virtual seminar on June 27th about small church dynamics. He's written a couple books about that. And I want to introduce you all to Karl. And let's see if I can get him up on screen here. There he is.
Hey
And
there.
hey, Karl. And it's great to see you. And I met Karl actually in Houston with the North America Mission Executives Conference. And he was able to share a whole lot about what small churches look like, and the value that they bring to the kingdom of God. And one of the things I remember, Karl, is that you rightly pointed out that that every historical innovation that's ever happened comes out of crisis. It doesn't come out of times that are good and times that are at peace, but crisis like this. And when we talk about the church right now, we're certainly facing a crisis. What kind of things are you seeing with smaller churches?
Yeah, that's really true. When things are going well, there's no need to innovate. We can just continue and do more of the same. But crisis clarifies. There are certain things you have to do during a crisis, and you just have to do it. You have to step up. You have to get it done. And so what I'm watching right now is I'm seeing a lot of churches that were kind of looking at, hey, I wonder if we should do online. I wonder if we should go live stream. And all of a sudden, all of the I wonders are gone. Yeah, we have to.
Yeah.
Even our church, we've live streamed our service for a while, but we've had issues where we actually had to turn it off for a few months because we weren't doing it. We had live stream issues and so on. And when this hit, within about 4 days, we got 4 months worth of work done.
Wow. Yeah.
Between deciding how we're going to do it and what we did. For instance, we don't live stream our Sunday morning services because we live in this weird, our church building is in this weird internet black hole where we can't rely upon the live stream on Sunday morning. So we figured out how to do a YouTube premiere. So we recorded in advance, loaded up to YouTube, and as long as YouTube doesn't go down, we're going to have a service, at 10 a.m. on Sunday morning that premieres, and then all of the staff actually is online and interacting even while we're watching our own selves on a screen. So we figured out in 4 days what it probably would have taken us in a normal circumstance about 4 months to work out. And that's happening in a whole bunch of other ways too. Crisis really does clarify what really does matter and what can we actually really do. And some of the biggest encouragements to me during this is how quickly and how well so many churches have stepped up and figured out how to do good ministry in new ways in this crisis. And that's been really probably the biggest encouragement to me from a church standpoint that's happened over the last month or so.
Yeah, and I imagine that it's even more critical with smaller congregations. One of the things that David Kinnaman was talking about on his last call was that for the first time in 7 weeks, they're starting to see some data that maybe churches that are a little bit smaller, 200 under 100, may struggle to survive through this whole thing. And what are they going to do to innovate? Are there some of the principles that you've explored in the past that are going to be more important in this time, do you think?
Yeah, no question about it. I'm having a lot of conversations with a lot of small church pastors through this. They say somewhere around 40,000 or so churches, close their doors every year. My guess is this year we're going to hit somewhere around 100,000. That's just the nature of it. The 40 grand that would have closed, another 40,000 that were on the edge, and then a bunch of others that thought they were solid, but this crisis is actually going to take them out. And there's all kinds of sadness around that. We wish that wasn't the case, but the first job of leadership is to define reality, and that's going to be part of our reality going forward, is a lot more church closures than before. So what I've been doing is I've been having conversations with a lot of small church pastors, and I've found that there are three dominant characteristics that are coming up in the difference between churches that are not just surviving, but actually thriving. And by thriving, I don't mean bringing in more money and having more people. I mean responding well to this crisis and really being there for people. And on the other hand, the ones that are either struggling or collapsing. And they're basic things. One of them, team-based leadership. The churches that only have a pastor doing everything, this is putting a burden on the pastor that they can no longer bear. They were already running at 110%. And they can't keep going anymore. But the churches that have a strong team-based leadership, volunteers, staff, and so on, people are now looking at it and going, how can we step up and help out? If you don't have a team-based leadership, you don't have a place to put them.
Mm-hmm.
So even just the fact of a team-based structure in leadership means we have a place to put people who are now stepping up to volunteer, more shoulders to bear the weight. Secondly, churches that had some resources set aside. It took us almost 10 years for us to put aside 6 months worth of funds. So our church can go 6 months with virtually no offerings, but it took us a decade to get there. A little bit a month for 10 years. But financially, we're doing fine during this. It's not a week to week. We're not going to lose our building. We're not going to have to stop paying anybody because we put this aside for an eventuality like this. And then the third thing is churches that are adaptable, churches that can't conceive of any other way of doing church other than the way they've done it. Now they have to do it in another way, and they don't know how. But churches that are ready to adapt, that are ready to change when they need to change their methodology while continuing with their principles. Those are the three things. So adaptability, resources, and team-based leadership are the key differentials between churches that are thriving and moving forward and churches that are collapsing or barely hanging on.
Well, those are great reminders. And the adaptability thing is something that's come up numerous times in conversations that I've had as well, that really it is adaptive leadership and adaptive organizations that survive in times like this, whether they're businesses or churches. Can they pivot? Can they flex? Can they try new things, or are they fixed and rigid? And that really pours into the leadership piece as well, in my opinion. And talk a little bit about the team-based leadership. Maybe if you don't have a staff, that type of thing. How do you engage laity in team-based leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question, because often when team-based leadership is taught from a church perspective, it's often taught by a big church pastor from a big church perspective, and that's fine. That's their perspective. But often the first step is, get a team together. Small church pastors going, yeah, a great idea, but where do I find one of those? Or they'll even make the assumption of, at your weekly staff meeting, and the weekly staff meeting, that's my spouse. I mean, right. So there are preliminary steps that small churches have to concern themselves with. The big churches don't necessarily have to concern themselves with. So if you're in a small church environment, what you want to do is don't start with getting a big team together. You don't have a big team, you don't have a big church. Start with one person who's got willingness, who's got passion, who is teachable, and who is available. When I came to our current church 27 years ago, there were a dozen people on a typical Sunday, 30 people on a big Sunday, and it was an older congregation. They'd gone through 5 pastors in the previous 10 years. They were tired, they were old, they were done. But there was one kid who was 20, and he was too young and naive to know how sick the church was. And so I exploited his naivete I said, I got one. I'm going to pour everything I have into him. And once a week we sat down. He was so young that I had coffee and he had chocolate milk. That's
Mhm.
literally true. But he was what I had. And so we
Yeah.
met every week and I taught him and worked with him. And, he made all kinds of mistakes, but he stuck with it and he became my right-hand man. And then he trained others and then I trained others after him. And it takes a long time, but it's worth it in the long run. So don't look for a big team. Don't rely on people who necessarily have titles. Although if you've got someone who has a title who's also willing and available and teachable, great. But
Mhm.
what you want to do is you want to find the person who's willing, available, and teachable. And whether they have a title or not, start investing in them. So you're investing your time and your energy in a person who is likely to be able to use what you're teaching them and is able to turn you're training a disciple to become a disciple maker. So,
Yeah.
but start with one, start with the willing. That's number one step in small churches, especially.
Absolutely. And this resonates, I think, with any pastor of any size church. I mean, where you finally hit that moment where you're like, wow, I just need somebody who understands and somebody I can pour this into. Follow that Second Timothy 2:2 model, that which you've heard from me, teach it to some who could teach it to others also, and just keep passing it down. That's absolutely key. And something that really captures me in your resources, and why I know that we engaged you for this small church uh, virtual seminar that we're going to be doing, is that so much of the information that we have comes from the large church context. And there's just such a huge difference in the way that you operate within a small church as opposed to a large church. Can you just give the people a little idea what they'll hear on June 27th when we have that meeting?
Yeah, the best way to maybe frame it, and this is kind of the picture around which everything I teach goes. I want you to imagine a Venn diagram, two circles that overlap by maybe 35% or so. And one circle is big church principles and the other circle is small church principles.
Mhm.
There is an overlap. There are some principles that apply in all churches of all sizes. And those are typically the things that we'll learn in seminary or Bible college, the basic ecclesiology, the teaching of the church. Every church, everywhere, this applies. But then you've got maybe 2/3 of the circle in the small church area that doesn't overlap with the big church. So when we hear from a big church pastor, they're teaching from their circle. And what they're teaching isn't wrong. It's simply in a different circle than ours. So maybe if you go to a big church conference or read a book by a big church pastor, what they're saying isn't incorrect, but maybe only about a third of it overlaps with your circle and will apply in your circle.
Mhm.
So in a small church context, we're not going to talk about the place where that overlaps because those are things that are fairly universal that anybody can teach. But there's 2/3 of that circle in the small church circle that doesn't overlap with the big church. It's just different. And within that circle, there's actually two sets of skills. One, there's the skills that all small churches have in common, where you talk to another small church pastor and you go, "Oh, you too. Oh, I thought it was just me," right? And so we'll spend a lot of time talking about what all small churches have in common. But there's a third skill set. And the smaller the church is, the more important this third skill set is. So, as a pastor, there are certain things that all churches have in common that all pastors can learn from each other. Then there's another third that I can learn from other small churches that all small churches have in common. But then there's another third of my skill set that only applies in my specific congregation,
Mm.
because the 50
Mm.
people I have in my congregation are different 50 people than you have in your congregation. And the smaller the church is, the bigger that unique footprint is, because in
Mm.
smaller groups, individual personalities affect the whole more often. Like if you got two churches of 2,000, certainly there are some distinctions, but they have far more in common than they have different because of something. It's actually a sociological phenomenon called the law of large numbers, which
Mhm.
states that the larger the group is, the more predictably it behaves.
Mhm.
So two groups of 2,000 are going to have a whole lot in common. But two groups of 50, you could be on different planets. I mean,
Mhm.
because of the individual personalities. So the small church pastor then has to figure out what is unique about my congregation as well. So when we talk about this, we're going to talk about that difference. There are certain things that we all know about pastoring or we can learn from anybody. There are certain things we can only learn from other small church pastors. And then I'm even going to talk about how do I learn my context better? How do I act like a missionary within my own neighborhood and in my own church and discover how to pastor uniquely to these people that God has given me to pastor. And
Oh, wow.
those are three different skill sets. They interact, but we're not
Mhm.
taught about them a lot. So that's really the main way we're going to focus as we talk about this together.
Wow, I just think this is so timely, and to have you scheduled for June 27th, I mean, it's almost like God knew what he was doing in setting this whole thing
Yeah.
up. And honestly, Karl, I actually feel that the advantage is going to slide to the smaller church who knows who it is, they know who they serve, and they're laser focused on that one thing, and not trying to be the bigger church and not trying to be a televangelist, right? In this time where you're doing your services online, but still connecting with your people in the one-to-one kind of heart-to-heart kind of way.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah, and I really appreciate your resources. If you go to karlvaters.com, you'll find some amazing resources there, especially the Spark resource, which is the Small Church Pastors Adapt and Recover Kit. And you find a lot of resources in there about what you're going to do next, given this reality. And then, of course, just want to keep pointing you to the Pacific Southwest District website, psd-lcms.org, where you'll find tons of resources on COVID-19 and just what you do organizationally for the church and personally as a leader. But then you'll also find information about this particular conference that we're going to have on June 27th. It's going to be live streamed. It's going to be free for all of our congregations, so you don't have to worry about a cost. And you'll find all of the details on the PSD website. So we want to encourage you to that. And I just want to thank you, Karl. I want to thank you for taking a few minutes with us and just sharing your heart for the small church. Any last things that you want to share with the people?
Yeah, just one thing. As small church pastors, especially as you're learning how to do things technically well, don't compare yourself to the high production value of the massive church down the street. We do that too often, even in the in-person thing. If they can see you, if they can hear you, and you're able to present what you need to present on Sunday morning, then move on to old school analog church stuff. Get on an actual phone, drive by their house, and call, yell at them from your car to their front door. Now more than ever, people need analog, real life, in person, voice to voice, and as much as we can do face to face ministry. The technical stuff matters, but right now everybody's really hungry for the stuff that small churches do particularly well.
Awesome. Awesome. Go analog. I'm going to show you analog right here. Karl's books, The Grasshopper Myth and Small Church Essentials. These are great books. And then you just put out a new one, 100 Days.
Yeah,
What's that
I
one?
know. The last blog post I wrote before all this hit was, "Hey, I've got a new book." World collapses. Uh, so yeah, my newest book is called 100 Days to a Healthier Church, which actually I think is going to be a really good read for folks as we come out of this. How do we recalibrate in 100 days to get back to not normal again, and not even a new normal, but some kind of place where we feel like we've got our feet on something solid. So 100 Days to a Healthier Church is the new book.
Great. Looking forward to it and looking forward to seeing you on the 27th. And thank you all so much. And we'll see you again soon.